Bettina, thanks for being here. Two things that every school system in America is responsible to do. One, intervene when they identify abuse and report. And two, actually teach kids from as young as kindergarten through 12th grade about how to prevent being in abusive situations. And I'll tell you firsthand, till today, most teachers are immensely uncomfortable dealing with the subject, avoid it entirely, and we have this kind of inertia that's been lingering for years. Your thoughts?
I have a couple of thoughts about it. One is that the teachers themselves, given the statistics, you have to have some percentage of those teachers themselves that have been in abusive situations and may currently be in abusive situations, for example, in a marriage or a partner relationship where there's domestic violence. So, which they have or have not processed. Mostly they have not processed. And so there's a percentage of your teachers that are themselves dealing with some fallout from or therapeutic issues themselves that are related to abuse issues. Especially female teachers. Statistically, more females are abused than, sexually anyway, than boys or men. But even that we're not sure of because the reporting is so scattered. So that's one factor. I think the other factor is that there is such a taboo against childhood sexual abuse, such a taboo, that everybody's very nervous about talking about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. I think the key thing that teachers have to recognize is that when you're nervous, when you yourself are nervous, the kids pick it up, and they are not going to talk to you. So you have to figure out how to do some kind of intense workshops or training with the teachers. Role-playing would probably work, something like that, where they really get some tools about how to handle these sorts of discussions and conversations. It's really vitally important. And the intervention at a younger and younger age is so helpful to the children. Also, teachers, if they are often very good teachers, the kids attach to them emotionally. And so if there's abuse going on in a family, the kids will attach to a teacher as the safe place. And to be able to talk to that safe person could really save a child's life. So I think much more is needed. I also know that teachers are very uncomfortable if a child comes in and starts reporting because they're obligated by law to report that to CPS, to Child Protective Services, and then they don't want the kid to talk about it because they don't want to have to do it. So this is also a very ingrained, deep social consciousness in our culture. I think it's a very false consciousness about the privacy of the family, that you don't intervene in private family matters. And of course, those of us that are my age that went through the women's movement, one of the things we know is that as for how long, for example, domestic violence was a private family matter handled in family court. The whole pressure was to get the couple to stay together no matter what was happening in that situation. And we know that that was disastrous. It was disastrous for the woman, it was disastrous for the children, and you know what? It was disastrous for the man who was the abuser, because he also needs help. Everybody needs help, and nobody's getting it. And I think we need to turn around the paradigm of how we're thinking about this, this issue and how we approach it. And there are very good tools available. There are very, very good, simple tools that are available to people that, that you can learn how to talk about it and how to work with it and how to really help the children. One other thing I might say about this is statistically, again, the statistics are not solid, but one of the things we know is that boys tend to be more physically abused and girls tend to be more sexually abused. That's the tendency. But it's abuse. It's abuse. So, and we also know that alcoholism and drugs interact with it. We know that. So the issues are intertwined. They're all intertwined. And the other thing that teachers need to know is that there are professional resources to help the children. So they're not stepping in as therapists. I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained as a therapist, but I can listen And I work at the college level, so it's a little different, but I can listen, and then I can help say, you should talk to so-and-so, or these services are available. And also you can repeat to the child over and over and over again, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. You are not provoking it, you are not doing it. Those are simple things that a person can do, just humanitarian, one-on-one that you can do.
It seems like, by the way, this reluctance to discuss a child abuse, you experienced that on a number of levels. One, in your memoir, Intimate Politics, that even very progressive people seemed really reluctant to, believe what you were saying, or think it was right that you should say this, or, it was like they couldn't process it. In a way, like what you said before, it seemed like the women's movement began to really take relationship issues out of a home as something that's just private, and make it a political thing, something we can talk about and analyze and deal with the inequality and the abuses. And it seems like that hasn't quite happened yet with child abuse. And your book, it strikes me as kind of a pioneering attempt to bring that same sensibility, and yet you had all this resistance. I wonder if you could say something about that. All these, it's not just teachers, it's even very progressive of folks who are, on most issues when it came to race or class, they'd be right out there saying, let's protect those who are powerless. And yet on this issue, they seem like they couldn't really do that. So I wonder if you could say something about that.
I can, and I'm happy to. So Intimate Politics, when it was published first in 2006, there was a big debate on the internet among historians. And the abuser in my case was my dad, who was a pretty well-known historian and communist and so forth. And and so the way a lot of people, they were almost all men, jumped to his defense to say that they knew him for X number of years and it was impossible that he could have done anything like this, and I was lying. Most of them, I don't think, had read the book yet because it hadn't actually been officially released. It was a month before it was actually available in bookstores. So unless they had review copies, I don't think they'd even read it. And I remember one professor who said this wouldn't stand up in a court of law. And I thought, you know what, I'm not in the court. I'm just trying to tell the story about the effect of child abuse on a person. There were some people that started to write to say, we need to listen to what someone's saying, we need to take this issue seriously. People on the left who also know my father, who wrote really wonderful, wonderful letters. And a professor of labor history at UCLA who wrote a beautiful public statement about her own abuse and how it had affected her and how grateful she was that this book would be published. And then it just sort of stopped. It just stopped. And then I received, and I'm going to talk about it at some length at a public talk later this week, hundreds of letters from people all over the country, and actually some from abroad, who were from left and progressive families, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, men and women, who had themselves been abused as children, either domestic violence, sexual abuse, rape by a family friend, that sort of thing, and silenced. And how grateful they were to read something where the silence was broken, and that you couldn't. I mean, part of the point here is that when you're silenced, you can't even begin to heal.
It sounds also like, that if you think about it, that many of them wrote you even if they didn't know you.
No, they didn't know
They
me.
don't have, in other words, they have nobody to talk to about
Right.
this.
No.
Like Fred was saying that teachers should be doing this, but they had nobody in their lives to talk to. So you were somebody who actually maybe the first person that they'd encountered, even though they didn't know you, and so they're writing to you. That in itself seems to suggest something really profound about
it was.
this.
And I didn't know most of the people I didn't know. I mean, some of the people I did, but most of them I didn't know at all. And I tried to answer as many people as possible because I felt that the issue was so important and that for them to write was very, very important. And occasionally I actually met with people because they'd be in the San Francisco Bay Area or I'd be in New York. I met somebody here in New York who had written to me the last time I was here in 2010 and in 2007. So I did that. But it's like this well. And the other thing I want to say, to be perfectly clear, is it's across the board. It doesn't matter about race, it doesn't matter about class, it doesn't matter about religion, it doesn't matter about politics. And the thing about left people is they were perfectly willing to accept stories about abuse I experienced from the police. Oh yeah, well, that's who because they had an ideological set that made that perfectly acceptable. But that it should come from the left, not acceptable. And I think if you were on the right, it would be the same thing. Right. No, the police wouldn't do anything like that. You know what I'm saying? Because there's like this ideological set that says certain people don't abuse. And the fact is, it's across the board.
Let's stay with this issue of power, because I think it really cuts to the chase when we talk about kids. I think it could be argued that children, perhaps the most powerless group of people in society today. And so how do we cut through and empower kids as young as 5, 6, 7, right on up, to be able to stand tall in the face of perhaps some very uncomfortable moments and seek help before abuse actually occurs? How do we do that?
Well, I don't have all the answers to anything like that. It would be really good to have some more forums and discussions about things like that, and maybe publications where people could talk about it. I do know that by and large, overall, children tell the truth. They tell the truth. Now, they may not understand all the dimensions of the truth, so they describe things that are happening to them without necessarily understanding all the implications of what they're saying. But it's very important to believe that when children come to you, they are telling the truth as they understand it.
And
That's one thing.
It sounds also like the issue about self-blame you talked about on the tape, and maybe having them understand it's not their fault and what their rights are on some level. Maybe that could be a piece of it as well.
But here's what happens. The self-blame is very deep. Even in a non-abusive, you take divorce. When parents get divorced, children invariably blame themselves for the divorce. And they had nothing to do with it. It's like they put them, because children have a tendency to put themselves at the center. And that's part of that's developmental. So, the parents have had a relationship long before the children were born, but as far as the children are concerned, they're the center of the parents' relationship, which, is not true. And when you're an adult and you look back, you know that it's not true because you're an adult and you can see that. But as a child, you're the center of the universe. So it's very, very hard for children. The other thing that's very hard for children, too, to understand is that they don't have a way of differentiating events that happen in their family, that some are more important than others. Everything is they don't have filters. They don't filter in the same way that adults do. So when things happen, it's just the same thing over. So they don't have a way of knowing that some things aren't important, or some things are going to dissolve, or some things, or somebody says something in anger and they didn't really mean it. They take it very personally, very deeply. So when you say you're not to blame, you should say that, but they don't internalize that. They don't internalize that. That's a long process before they get to the point. Any person gets to the point of understanding that it wasn't their fault. And you can say it over and over again, and people still will, in their minds, blame themselves for things that they did or things that they said. Children are very vulnerable to that. But I think the start of empowerment for children is speaking and being listened to, being believed, and being heard. That's the first thing. Without judgment. No judgment. No, you're bad. No judgment like that. I think that's the first step toward empowerment, and the first step toward a particular sense of self-confidence. I think the other thing that helps children a lot are certain forms of musical or artistic or kinesthetic dance therapies kind of thing that teachers can do. You don't have to be an expert to do it, but getting kids to move around is very, very helpful, or to draw. Or listen to music. It can be because the creative side can be very, very helpful to children as a form of empowerment.
One other thing that strikes me as really important is that since they're children and they're reluctant to talk about it, maybe teachers have not ever heard from someone who was affected by child abuse what impact it has on them psychologically. And I wonder if you could say something about that.
On the children or the teachers?
On the children. In other words, because so they understand the nature of the problem. I'm just wondering, how, you talk about that in your memoir. Maybe you could just say something about that so they can be aware of that.
I think probably people underneath know this, but child sexual abuse is, and physical abuse, the abuse is foundational. And it takes a long time to recover from it. For some people, it's a lifetime. And really, because the internalization of a shame, which is a very difficult, shame is a very difficult emotion, the internalization of self-blame, the internalization of something wrong with you, there's something wrong with you fundamentally. This was certainly true for me. And then it can also get superimposed on other things. For example, children of color are then dealing with racism, and they're getting messages all over about being less than, and stuff in their communities, with the police, with images that they see on television, with who's the criminal in the society, all these sorts of things. It could be Chicano, well, what we call Chicano, Mexican American, Puerto Rican kids in New York, African American children, Native Americans. Oh my gosh, the suicide rate among Native American young people is the highest in the country. And part of that is just the desperation of their conditions. So, and then you look at the statistics of how many young black men are in prison, or on parole, or in the prison. Oh my God, the whole thing is they're criminalized. So that also is damaging, and internalizes a lot. So when you have the abuse on top of that, or in my case, a left family that's being persecuted, and then I was a lesbian, so that's later, but all that gets superimposed on it, and so the internalization, the idea that you're evil or something wrong with you, that you can never be healed, that it's hopeless, that you're just a bad person, all that gets deeply embedded.
So it sounds like for teachers, I just want to say, it seems to me like what you're saying in a way is that the way towards healing of this is a long process, and it begins with being able to talk about it, and the teacher should become like the first, or a refuge for making that process, helping that process to begin. So it's not simply a matter of stopping the physical abuse, but also providing a sort of a life jacket, or something that can give the
you're throwing a kid a life raft. That's
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, here's another factor too, which is you don't want to be overzealous.
Mm-hmm.
You have to find a balance.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say one other thing. Children that have been abused have experienced a tremendous invasion of boundaries. Their boundaries have already been invaded physical boundaries to a tremendous degree. And so you have to be very aware of that when talking to them, and let them try to help them to set, because most of us who've been abused have to learn how to set boundaries. We don't have them, but we have to learn how to do that. And we just tend to let people walk in, Either that, or we act out very violently. People also act out of a lot of violence, to protect themselves. But the boundary issue is important to understand.
Tina, let's stay with that again. I'm a third grade teacher. I have 8-year-old children in front of me, 25 of them. And I want to step in and I want to talk about how there are adults, some adults who should care for us very, very much and should love us, that sometimes touch us in ways, that sometimes do things to us that are hurtful, that make us feel uncomfortable. What's your advice to the teacher in terms, how do I step into that arena? How do I begin to open up that conversation, whether it be an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, a middle school kid, that there are people who will touch us in ways that are not good, that can be hurtful. And I want to talk to you about that. How do you do that? What would be your advice?
Well, I think it's hard. You have to do it. You have to get them to that point. But one of the things you can do is separate out a person's behavior from being a bad person. Like your father or your mother may not be a bad person. They themselves may have been hurt. And so then they hurt because they haven't had an opportunity to talk to someone to help them. So that sometimes shifts a little bit, because then the children can see that maybe they're helping their parents rather than hurting them. That they're not blaming them, but they're trying to help them. And so But I felt very strongly about that with my father. In my particular case, I was sure that he had been abused as a child, and I was sure that that's where that was coming from. And I really wanted him to talk about it with me because I thought I could help him before he died. And he would start. We would be together, and he would start. I could see that he was thinking of something that had happened. I thought the abuser was his father, but he would start, and then it would either become a joke, or he would divert it to something else, and it was gone. It was like this moment, there would be these moments, and he couldn't go there. He just couldn't do it. Well, that's a lifetime. The guy was 87 when he died, so that's a lifetime of denial and embedded. And what it would have been like when he was young, if he'd been able to work with somebody about this. And I think it crippled him. I think it hurt him emotionally through his entire life. I think he was a little nuts. I say that with affection, but I think he was a little crazy. He was very fanatical about the communist stuff, And I think that it's foundational, and I think it affected everything about him. So that's true, So I think if children can begin to understand that they would actually be helping their parents as well as helping themselves, maybe something like that might be the way to go.
And by the way, that reminds me of the memoir itself, that when people were attacking you for talking about this without having read the book, they don't really get that you were very compassionate. I think that's sort of what you're evoking here, that everybody here has a problem, and you're not the police. You're a concerned human being trying to right a wrong, and so I think that comes out, compassion and love, and it's not like big brother coming after somebody. It's like trying to stop something that's really abusive and needs to stop. So I
had a situation, I won't name who this child was, but a child that was afraid of somebody that I knew. And the person that I knew, I didn't see this, it was a woman, as frightening. But the child was afraid of her. And my first response was to say, well, why is he doing, the child was a boy, why is he doing that? And then when I thought about it, I thought, well, something happened. And he's afraid of her. Now, he expressed it, and he didn't want to be with her alone. Okay. So we made sure he wasn't. It wasn't such a big deal. And then it went away. So we don't know what happened. And he couldn't really explain it. I don't think it was abusive. I don't really know. But he's not lying. This child was not lying. And he was too little to be able to really, something frightened him. Who knows what it was? Okay, that's all. So, but he's believed. And he asked for something, and we made sure that that's what happened. And then the fear went away. We also talked to the person. She couldn't imagine what it was, but, she said, okay, take it easy, like that, See, it can be, a lot of these things, so you don't know, you don't have to jump, that's another thing for teachers, you don't have to jump to the conclusion that the children are actually being systematically abused. You don't have to jump to that conclusion. They may or may not be, but you need to allow them to talk and believe that they're not lying to you, and then try to figure out how to help everybody.
Thinking about resources and things to read, because it seems to me like we talked about this before, there's some books and some things that, and also organizations that you've encountered in the course of doing the research that went into your, thinking about this problem as you process. And I wonder if you could say something about it. If you had either some books or some groups that you could refer people to. I mean, I know in schools you refer to professionals, but I'm just saying for a teacher to come up and read something over the summer about this and think about organizations, what would you recommend?
Well, I think one of the best writers on this subject was Judith Herman, who's, she passed away a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken, but she was an MD, a psychiatrist, and she taught, I think, at Harvard Medical School. And her books on trauma and abuse of children and women and so forth are just outstanding. And I've used them over and over again. You see, when you're working with older people, you can also do this with teachers to show them something. Maybe I can sort of illustrate this. And I think I'm not sure I got this from Herman's book. I might have gotten it from one of my colleagues who does counseling at Santa Cruz, but she explained something to me that was very interesting. if you make a line on a piece of paper as though this is your life continuum, you have a little child over here, and then abuse happens somewhere along that line. Now, if the abuse is not repeated, if it's just a one-time incident, the child will just absorb it, and then the line will just go on and it'll continue. But if the abuse is repeated over and over again, what happens is the child develops two realities. So there's the reality, and so there's a split. The child develops an inner life that is not congruent with the outer life. And the inner life is the one that's dealing with the abuse. And the outer life is the one that's presenting themselves to the world. And you can see that with many children. They appear overly competent, overly happy, everything's fine, I have a perfect child, family, that sort of thing. And then underneath that, they have an alternate reality because this abuse is going on and they can't talk about it. So this model that they use is part of showing you how children, it's coping, it's dissociation, it's a form of dissociation, and in a way it's healthy, but it's also harmful in any kind of long-term way because in very, very abusive situations you get multiple personalities. That's where it comes from. Very, very abusive, very like ritualistic sadism or something like that. But, in the normal run of things, there has to be a point at which when the child gets to a point where they can talk about it, the two lines, the internal life that's so different from the presented life. Does that make sense? As presented, the internal life, they come together. That's the healing process. You no longer need, but when you have the other alternative inner reality, you feel like you're crazy. You feel like you're totally nuts, because all this is going on and it's really your reality, but nobody can see it. And I experienced this. When I read this, I knew exactly what this person was talking about. It was exactly right. It was on target, And then when the healing starts, that inner life is no longer needed, and you bring it back so that they become congruent, become much more emotionally authentic and at that presenting level. But when that process starts, right at that moment, the person is usually in crisis and weeping, crying, or whatever, because there's a recognition they've been hurt or whatever. A lot of this depends on age, I understand that. With my college kids, that's what happens. They just cry. And I just let them cry. I just sit with them until they stop crying. They'll stop eventually. And they stop, and then they'll tell you, and then you figure out what's the best strategy to help them. It's not to be afraid. That's my point about the story, is you don't have to be afraid of the emotion that emerges. It's just emotion. It's going to go away.
Staying with emotions, if we could, I want to go back. You said, to your previous allusion to shame.
Yeah.
And I want to stay with that for a moment, and because we have a lot of teachers looking at this tape now, and folks from the school system just starting out, how powerful that emotion can be,
yes,
and how detrimental.
Yes.
It perhaps is the biggest predictor of personal failure, feelings of shame.
Right.
What would you say to the teachers that are watching this tape right now about how to deal with that? If you could give them some advice about dealing with the sense of shame that so many kids experience, whether it's from abuse, racism, classism, so many kids feel shame.
So part of this is developmental with children, is internalizing whatever the situation is and feeling the shame. Probably the most useful thing a teacher could do, I think, if he or she was willing. So you have to, process yourself and what's comfortable for you, is to relate a personal experience of themselves being ashamed, and what it was that allowed them, why they felt ashamed, what the emotion was, the strength of it, and then what allowed them to see that they were really okay and they had nothing to be ashamed of. And very often, I think with young people, when that happens, because it's someone else's shame, and they think, well, why were they ashamed of that? That's no big deal. What was their problem? Because it's outside of themselves, you see. And so it allows them to see that the emotion, while it has this terrible force inside them, is actually not so terrible.
Well, one of the things when we did that book event, I remember there was a sort of an organization of people who've been abused, and that I guess so. There's this whole world of people trying, and I wonder if you could say something about these groups and your experience with them.
I never actually interacted with many of these groups. I've done workshops with like family services in Santa Cruz, and also some of the psychological associations, who've asked me to do kind of workshops for their therapists, which feels a little odd, because I was the one that needed therapy, so what do I know? But I did do some of that work with them, and it's interesting to talk about it. Gay and lesbian people experience shame in very similar ways. So there's a because you feel so outside the norm of what's acceptable, and shame is shame. So being able to talk about that process, regardless of the source of the shame, is very helpful. So I've done that, and that I think you can. I wanted to say something else also, which is that when the women's movement tried to raise the issue, or did raise the issue of sexual abuse, there was a tremendous backlash. Remember that backlash, including from women. There's one woman in particular who was very vocal about this, claiming that it was false memory, that whole false memory syndrome. Now this is not the same thing for children, because they're too young to have false, but and then there were these terrible lawsuits where the fathers countersued their children and there were trials, and it was an awful, awful, awful thing. And then all this publicity about it, which really chilled the willingness of people to talk about it. And I think that's part of the discomfort. Because the crux of the false memory thing, so it might be worth talking about this with teachers, the crux of it was that it was the therapist who introduced the idea of the abuse, and then the client or the patient ran with it and made up a whole fantasy about abuse. That was the crux of the charge. So teachers, if they've read this stuff or heard about this, they may feel that what they're doing is they're planting a seed, and the child is going to invent some story. And that's why I go back to this point that children, by and large, do not lie. And just to let them talk and hear, and then you can figure out, you're teachers, you're intelligent, compassionate people, you figure out what's the best thing to do. Who should I talk to? I talk to some, professional. Should I, get some advice about how to handle this situation? I think but I think that may have influenced a lot of people in being so terribly uncomfortable about this, is this idea of false. And in the case of children, they're not old enough to falsify memory. I mean, that's not what's going on. The other thing is the enormity of the abuse in the Catholic Church. Oh my gosh, going back, 30 years more? Was like, it seemed to be endemic. But I think that's also, for people to understand that dynamic is very, very important.
I was wondering, especially
teachers to understand that dynamic.
Since you're a historian, do you feel as if there's been progress made in terms of being able, from, say, the time you published your book, that are we making progress in getting people to open up about this, or do you think we're still, at a very early stage, and it's society is still super reluctant? Having gone through this whole thing with your book, do you feel, I don't know whether it's really it's optimistic or pessimistic, maybe that's not the way to frame it, but I just wonder, how do you see that? Do you think that, obviously the women's movement made all this great progress in discussing, in taking these what's considered personal and private issues and make it subject to public discourse. Do you feel like we're getting somewhere, and that your book contributed to that? How do you
Well, I think on a personal level with the book, I think it contributed to help many people. I don't want to make any grandiose claims for the book.
Sure.
I think many of the people who read it found it very helpful, certainly in terms of writing to me. And if that's just, for somebody to write is a big thing. So for maybe there's another 10 people who read the book for whom it was helpful that didn't write, something like that. So I feel very good about that. Overall, I think there's been an escalation of violence against women in this culture, a tremendous escalation. I think it's worse. It's amazing how much violence there is. It's in the films, the reassertion of sexualization, the commodification, sexualization, objectification of women is just worse now. And if you have any doubts about it, it's interesting to go back and look at a film in the 1950s, even the 60s, a commercial film. Just look at it. Just watch a film. And then compare it with what you see now. And they look so tame. They just look completely tame, And there's not that level of violence. Just the violence in films, never mind against women, just the violence in films is appalling. And we're so inured to it, we don't even really register it. I'm saying this because the violence in the video games influences enormous thousands of these, maybe tens of thousands of these young people. And they're very, very, very violent. And you're killing people in the video game. Then you make that transition from there to war, where you're actually killing people. And what happens psychologically to you, when you're doing that?
Well, maybe it's related to the abuse in this way that, the culture is really very comfortable with violence.
Yes, that's my point.
And with abuse, and not really comfortable with sort of talking about peace and mediation and intervention to stop abuse. So
right. And reconciliation and all of that. And then look at Abu Ghraib. Look at the way we sexually abused prisoners at Abu Ghraib, in Iraq under the Bush administration. I mean, it's awful, really awful.
And so I guess
I think it's worse.
Yeah.
And so part of this is, the abuse is, I think it's escalated. One other thing maybe I can make a connection is, I've long thought, you see, it's usually not written about this way, but under slavery in the United States, child sexual abuse of slaves, of slave girls, was intrinsic to the system. There was no, wasn't even acknowledged as a crime, much less rape of women, but there was child sexual abuse. And it's never been addressed, except maybe by a few people, it was very acceptable, and it inundated the culture. We want to make that connection between our own history and what enslavement meant, and then now you have the trafficking in women also, including in the United States, tens of thousands of girls and women. Very lucrative business.
Mm-hmm. So I guess
coming from the global south, from the former socialist countries in Eastern Europe. So I think it's worse.
And so the message to teachers is that to try to enlist them in stopping this trend, right? I mean, that you can create a safe haven in your classroom. Is that how?
Yes, and you can, and consciousness about it, and you have nothing to be uncomfortable about. This culture ought to be uncomfortable and ashamed of itself.
We have a lot of young educators looking at this tape right now. And so many of them are being taught, and I've got to say, by higher education, by higher academia, that teaching your subject is by far the single most important thing you can do, and do it well. And meanwhile, we have so many social, emotional, and health-related needs of kids. Talk to them right now about how very important what we've been discussing here for a half hour, how this is what so much of our education should be.
Well, I think the main thing is, if you think about teach your subject well. Yes, you want to teach. If you're a math teacher or English teacher or history teacher, whatever you do, you want to really master it, teach it well. You want to be creative in how you're teaching it, things like that. It's all wonderful. And if you're dealing with children who are abused in alcoholic families, drug related, stuff going on, poverty, not eating properly, they can't learn. They can't even focus. They can't even do a sound bite, much less a 30, how long a class is, 40 minutes? I don't know how long they are. I teach for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm like that's my class, like an hour and 15 minutes. You turn me on, an hour and 15 minutes, turn me off. But I joke with my kids around that. But the point is, they can't learn this way. So your ability to teach your subject well is dependent upon your ability to create a safe, healthy, wholesome classroom. If you can't do that, they can't learn.